our main event. A J Sidransky is the author of critically acclaimed work such as Forgiving Maximal Rothman, a finalist in Outstanding Debut Fiction in 2013 by the National Jewish Book Awards, Stealing Summer's Affection, a finalist for Best Second Novel in 2015, and Forgiving Mariela Camacho, recipient of the David R. and Deadly Ink Writers Conference for Best Mystery of 2015. His next book, The Interpreter, was released March 2020 and was shortlisted by Next Generation Indie Book Awards for Historical Fiction 2020. His most recent book, Forgiving Stephen Redmond, the final chapter of the Forgiving series, was released January 2021, and it is the book that we're celebrating today. A J Sidransky lives in Washington Heights in Upper Manhattan with his wife. He is a dyed-in-wool New Yorker, born in the Bronx, and a lifelong Yankees fan, and was watching a Yankees game right now. Led Black is a Dominican-American writer, blogger, thinker, and entrepreneur who grew up in Washington Heights. He is the editor-in-chief of the Uptown Collective, which has established itself as the voice of Uptown online. Take it away, guys.
So first of all, thank you, everyone. Thanks to Word Up, who is an indispensable part of this neighborhood. Thank you to Emmanuel and everyone that works at Word Up. Thank you to Veronica. Thank you to the Washington Heights and Noma as well. And Alan, here we go again. You know, you got a new book. Before we get into the book, I think are we doing a reading first and then we get into it? Is that what we're gonna do?
You know what? If you want to do a little bit of a reading, I could be very happy to do the opening of the book.
Perfect. Let's do that, and then we get right into it.
Compelling.
Perfect.
So this prologue has this is the prologue, and it's dated the 5th of July, 1966 at 3 a.m. in the morning. Hands worked deftly, applying plaster to lath. With each application, the face of the dead man receded a bit more into darkness, never to be seen or heard from again. The plasterer found that thought satisfying. This criminal didn't deserve the propriety of remembrance. His name would be blotted out, forever erased from memory. At the same time, an ache settled into the plasterer's soul, one that he knew he would never leave him. He'd gotten what he wanted, but it didn't feel right. It didn't feel right the way he expected it to feel. How empty, how devoid of satisfaction this revenge was. Not at all what he'd imagined. He'd planned it out, choreographed it like a ballet, but in the end, the dance took on a life of its own. The story wrote its own ending. Before placing the last lump of plaster on the wire mesh, the plasterer stared at the face inside one final time. Unexpectedly, though, he recognized the face in death. It was in some way different than in life. In life, the face had been calculating, self-important, overly confident. In death, it appeared confused. It would wear this expression for eternity. With all its cockiness, it never saw what was coming. And when death came, this face was shocked and would remain so forever. The plasterer spread the last of the wet, sandy, putty-like mortar over the fine mesh encasing the dead man forever. He smoothed it out, the wall becoming whole again. Tomorrow, he would paint the entire room. His stomach turned a bit, as if he were about to vomit, but there was nothing in it to expel. He hadn't eaten in hours. He kept the dry heave at bay, straightened himself up, and stretched his arms high into the air and behind his head, bits of half-dry plaster flying off his clothes and hair. Memory overwhelmed him, yet there was no satisfaction. Even this was not enough, but it would have to be. The dead were buried now, both here and in Santo Domingo. Life would go on. Perhaps he would too, if only he could learn to forgive himself.
Wow. You know, and it's funny with that book, it starts off that way and it never lets you go, you know, from the beginning to the very last moment, which I really love. But before we get into this particular, you know, Forgiving Stephen Redmond, this is part of a series, the Forgiving series. Can you tell us a little bit about the series and this book's place in it?
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, thanks, Led, and thank you to Word Up and to all the attendees. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me tell you a little bit about how the series came to be and how it played out. So some years ago, after I had moved to Washington Heights in 2003, I decided I wanted to write a novel set in the neighborhood. And I built that novel around a personal story, which was that of my uncle, my grandfather's brother, who had been a refugee from Europe under the Nazi regime and had gone to the Dominican Republic and lived in a place called Sosua, which was a refugee settlement in the north of the Dominican Republic, where 854 European Jews escaped death by the hands of the Nazis. And one of the things that really struck me so intensely when I moved up here was both the position of the local Jewish community, the position of the Dominican community, of which I became, I became involved in and made friends among the Dominican community, and how they related and didn't relate to each other. And that was a very big part of the story that played out in Forgiving Maximo Rothman. So if you haven't read Forgiving Maximo Rothman, I don't want to give away too much. And basically it is a murder mystery. And an old man who had been a settler in Sosua, who came to the United States after World War II with his wife, he's found near to death in his apartment, and the accused is a young Dominican man who works for him part-time as a part-time caregiver. And so the story plays out against this sort of clamor that goes on about this, because the old man dies about this murder and actually who did it. But I can't tell you who did it because you had to read the book. Now, when I wrote this book, it was intended to be a standalone novel. I really never had any intention of writing a series. But many people said to me, you left a lot of loose ends. And how is it that, are you going to write another book to tie together those loose ends, or a book or two? And at the same time, I had a writing group with 5 other authors who we met once every couple of weeks to help each other. It's a very common thing among writers. And they all said to me, these characters, particularly the 2 detectives, one, Tolya Kurchenko, who's a Russian-American detective who comes from Russia and settles in Washington Heights in the 80s. As most of you who live in Washington Heights would know, we have a large community of people like that here. And the other is a Dominican-American detective who came to the United States in the 1980s. And he also, lives in the neighborhood, and they both represent the neighborhood. And that they were a very popular kind of team, and people said to me, they have legs. So I decided that, in fact, I would write a sequel. The first sequel I wrote was Forgiving Mariela Camacho. Sometimes as a writer, you don't always do things in order, and the muse was upon me for that particular book. And that book really, the same way that Forgiving Maximo Rothman tells the backstory of Tolya Kurchenko, Forgiving Mariela Camacho, also told in the form of a murder mystery, tells Pete Gonzalvez's backstory. And so that was actually written second, but it's actually the 3rd book in the series. So what was missing was this thing in between. And that ultimately became Forgiving Stephen Redmond. So who is Stephen Redmond? Stephen Redmond is Max Redmond's son. So Max Redmond was Maximo Rothman. And when he came to this country, he changed his name and became Max Redmond. They had a son who they named Stephen and last name Redmond, but he, as he grew older and became in his college years, he decided to return to traditional Judaism. The term for that in the Jewish world is something called Baal Tshuva, which literally means to own the answer. Or so he becomes an Orthodox person. And so Stephen Redmond and Shalom Rothman are actually the same person. So the reason I wrote that is because many people asked me about, well, what happened to them when they came to the United States? Because in the book, it's obvious in Forgiving Maximo Rothman that they leave the Dominican Republic and they come to the United States. And I really wanted to tell that story and tie up certain other loose ends, which again, can't tell you because you got to read the book, which have to do with this young Dominican guy who was the caregiver. So that ultimately became Forgiving Stephen Redmond. So the right order to read them in is Forgiving Maximo Rothman, Forgiving Stephen Redmond, Forgiving Mariela Camacho, but they can be read alone or in any order. But if you're going to read the whole series, that's the order you read it in. So the other thing was that, I had really watched the change that was coming over the neighborhood, and I really wanted to talk about that. And that's a subject I really dealt with in this book.
And I would be remiss if I didn't thank you for my cameo appearance in this novel. I'm honored I really thank you for that. How did that come about? You know, that I became, because you surprised me when I read. I'm like, oh wow, that's me and my mom. So
I should tell the audience that in fact I did not tell Led that I was going to give him a small part in the book.
yeah.
But why is he there? Okay. So first of all, because I like to honor my friends by including them in my stories and books when I can.
Thank you.
And I try to do at least one in every book. So in this particular case, it was natural because the story in the book involves what those of you who live in Washington Heights will remember is there used to be a stand of wood houses on the very steep hill street at 187th between Broadway and Wadsworth. Those houses, and by the way, the house on the cover is an actual picture of one of those houses.
Right. And they're gone now. So
they're gone. That's it. They're history.
Yeah,
but yet nothing has appeared there. You know, with all the fanfare, the digging the big hole, it's just a big puddle now.
It's a big pit, basically.
Yeah, it's nothing. So I had the scene in the book where Tolya Kurchenko, the detective, he needs to learn about the buildings because as from what I just read to you, what happens without giving anything away is that the buildings are under demolition and the crews find a body plastered into a wall on the third floor of one of the buildings. And, you know, they have to figure out, well, where did this come from? So it's what's known in police work as a cold case. And you know, just to take a step to the side for a minute, Forgiving Maximo Rothman they're all murder mysteries. The first one is a crime of passion. Stephen Redmond is a cold case, and Mariela Camacho involves a serial killer. So I cover 3 different types of murders in the series, which, you know, as a mystery writer, is something I wanted to do.
Nice.
So when I got to the part where the detective had to start researching the buildings and find out, you know, start doing, you know, police work, I needed him to talk to someone who knew the neighborhood and knew everything about the neighborhood. So that's who he finds is Led. And how does he find him? By Googling. And what comes up? An article that was in fact on your, you know, Uptown Collective. So then he goes to meet Led, and Led fills him in on, you know, what he knows about the properties and the stories and the urban legends that go with it. And that's how you got in there.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. So forgiving, you know, is a real important concept, you know, in this book and in the series. It's a constant theme. You know, it's something that it's not just Stephen. There's multiple characters dealing with this forgiving themselves and forgiving. Why is forgiving so important in this book and in life in general?
All right, so forgiveness, I think, is a very important concept in life in general. We'll start with that because if you don't learn to forgive and you can't learn to walk away from the anger and the hurt, it'll consume you. And that really, I think if you read all or any of the books, that is really what becomes sort of obvious to the reader, that you can't carry this pain with you, that it's going to eat you alive. And that sort of stretches through the whole thing. And in each case, we see a main character who is, you know, having a hard time either forgiving himself or his past or his parents or someone for something they did that really hurt him or her. And, you know, it's important that we reach this point of forgiveness. You know, there's a tagline to each book. The tagline to Forgiving Maximo Rothman is, life is too short to make enemies of those we love. The tagline to Mariela Camacho is, we each have our own destiny. But the tagline to this book is, and I love this, sometimes revenge is more important to the soul than forgiveness. And with that statement, there is a very long process in this book, throughout the entire book, of this understanding whether or not this revenge is, you know, is in fact more important than forgiving the circumstance, yourself, and whoever else is involved. And, you know, for me, it was an important subject. I really wanted to examine it because it related to a lot of things in my own life in terms of my relationship with my parents and things that had happened to me. And I was at a very critical juncture when I started writing seriously. I just passed the age of 50. It was just around the time of the Great Recession. I was having tremendous career issues as a result of that. And I really needed to take a real hard look at my life and figure out where I was going. And where it ultimately led me was to become a full-time writer.
So you didn't start that till when?
Oh, I didn't start writing Forgiving Maxwell Rothman until about 2007.
And you didn't start becoming a writer, like as a writer, what, in your 50s, really?
Yeah, I was past 50. I had written. All right, so I don't know if I ever told this story on one of these shows or not, one of these things or not. By the way, someone asked a question in the chat about audiobooks. They're contracted now, and the audiobooks on these will be out sometime later this year. So what's interesting is that, okay, so when I was 17 years old, I was obviously living with my parents. We lived in a small town up in Connecticut called Trumbull, Connecticut. Originally, I was from the Bronx. And when I was 13 years old, almost 14, we moved to Connecticut because my father changed his job and he got a new job up there. We moved up there. It was a tiny little town and it was tremendous. This was in 1970 and it was huge kind of, sort of culture shock for me because I had grown up in New York where, everyone is a New Yorker. And I moved to this place where every time I opened my mouth, they're looking at me like, what is that accent? So, when I was 4 years later, I'm graduating from college. I'm graduating from high school, rather. My parents said to me, going off to the University of Connecticut, what do you want to study and what do you want to be? To which I say, I want to study English and I want to be a writer. I want to write novels. And my parents look at me and they say in unison, no, 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 no. That's not for a Jewish boy and you'll never make a living. So that was the end of that until I turned 50. So I had written over the years, but mostly about real estate, which is the business that I was in. I was a commercial mortgage broker for about 25, 30 years. And that's kind of how I sort of pay the bills now. I work for a real estate magazine and I write for them because I know that business and I know how to write. But this was very important to me to do this thing, to write a novel. I was an avid reader growing up and I loved fiction. And I really, really wanted to write a book. So Forgiving Maxwell Rothman was not actually my first manuscript. What was my first manuscript was Stealing a Summer's Afternoon, which was my second book that I published. I could not find a publisher for that. No way, no how. No one wanted to publish it. It just didn't click with anybody. And I was already had that out there looking for a publisher. And then I started writing Forgiving Maxwell Rothman. And about 2/3 of the way through writing the book, or halfway through writing the book, which was in July of 2009, I lost my job at the last bank I worked for as a commercial mortgage lender. And my wife said to me, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, there's no jobs anymore in the real estate business because the real estate business just collapsed. So as did the economy. So, there's no job for me. So I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get certified as a personal trainer to earn some money. And I want to finish my book. And she said to me, okay, because she had a good job at the time. And she had medical insurance and security and all that. So I was able to do that. And then I finished writing Forgiving Maxwell Rothman. I did find a publisher who I no longer publish with, but I did find a publisher. And that's when I really started seriously writing fiction. I've written short stories. I've written 5 novels. And I'm actually working on 2 books at this time, and I've got some other concepts, and I hope I live long enough to get all this stuff out.
Well, it's funny because it seems like you're trying to make up for lost time because
Exactly.
you're really prolific, right? So we have our regular lunches around here, and every time we have a lunch, you got a new novel you're working on. The way you put out really good work.
Thank you.
It's admirable, and I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you find the time and the solace to do that. One thing I love about your work, not just the Forgiven series, but all of it, all of it. It has this kind of really global dimension and time-wise. So it's like you're skipping from time, and then also on the planet, you're all over the place, which I love, right? It encompasses so much, And one of the things that I find interesting is, particularly with this series, is like the Holocaust, Hitler, Trujillo, all these things haunt the books and haunt the people still, right? So there's this kind of intergenerational trauma that's really big in these books, but it's really big in life, right? We all kind of carry the burdens of our ancestors in a lot of ways. So if you could talk a little bit about the intergenerational trauma and how it expresses itself in life and in your books.
I'm so glad you asked me about that. So I'd like to talk specifically to start about this book and something I did in this book. And then I want to talk a little bit about the idea of transgenerational trauma. So the title character, Stephen Redmond, is the son of Holocaust survivors. So the survivor is a very broad term. It's most generally used, or it's most commonly used for people who were interred in concentration camps and death camps and who survived. But there's another class or group of people who lived in Europe, Jews who lived in Europe, who escaped from Europe and didn't end up in camps. They are generally considered to be in the same classification as survivors, but I write about refugees. These are the people I write about. They are refugees from Nazi Europe, from Hitler. I have, first of all, much more experience with that because I have many members of my family. Well, listen, 112 members of my family died in death camps. The ones that I knew who made it here were refugees. They came as children, and some came before, and as adults, either immediately before or after the war. So this is something that's haunted me, and I've thought a great deal about this, about the subject, of how this affects people who come after their children and grandchildren. And it's been documented that there is a transgenerational trauma, that the experiences of these people are passed down. Now, this is not limited to Hitler or the Nazis. And, I've spent a lot of time in the DR, as you know. My best friend is Dominican, and I go there every winter to spend, 3 weeks with him or so. And I've been going, well, I didn't go this year because of COVID, obviously, but I've been doing this for the last 12 years, and I've spent a lot of time there. I speak a reasonably understandable Dominican Spanish, and I'm able to, function. And I've learned a lot about the country. So that brings me to the issue of Trujillo. So, Trujillo plays a lot of parts here because in Forgiving Maxwell Rothman, Trujillo is important because he opened up the DR to potential Jewish settlement, or to Jewish refugees. Now, while he offered to take up to 100,000 Jewish refugees over 10 years, with 10,000 the first year, only 854 refugees came. That has more to do with the international Jewish leadership, which is a whole nother story that we don't have time for tonight, than it has to do with Trujillo. But the fact of the matter is that Trujillo did not have altruistic reasons for doing this. Trujillo was a vicious dictator, and he was a serial rapist. Sounds like somebody who used to occupy the White House right here in the United States. Yeah. So, he was a very bad guy. And the truth is that in the 31 years of his rule over the Dominican Republic, he murdered 51,000 Dominicans, his own people, in his own forms of concentration camps, because they were his political opponents. And, the whole system that he evolved there was in fact a fascist system. So there's no question that people who suffered from this, and for this book, I interviewed a number of people, and it's interesting because this conversation about Trujillo and what he did with young women goes back for me some 15 years. When I first joined Jay's Big Gym on 181st Street, and I started meeting people from the Dominican Republic and whose families came from there. And inevitably, when they found out that my uncle had lived in Sosua, they would say, oh, my grandmother comes from Puerto Plata or nearby, and she used to work in Sosua, or she knew people in Sosua. And ultimately, you end up hearing the story about, how their grandmothers were potential victims of Trujillo's philandering. So, I really presented, and this I can tell readers without sort of giving away the book, is that there is a character in the book who's important in the investigation of this cold case, who is a professor of Dominican studies at CUNY, right here in Harlem. And it turns out that, his family has this experience, and he only learns about this as a result of his aiding in the investigation. And the response that his parents give him is very similar to the response that a lot of the Holocaust survivor parents of what we call second generation Jews, they get the same response. We didn't want to talk about it. We didn't want to burden you with what happened to us. So there's this big hole in their history, and they feel this hole. And eventually they know that the behavior of their parents is not necessarily normal. And eventually this comes out, and it's very devastating. And it's not limited to Dominicans under Trujillo. And it's not limited to Jews from Hitler. And it's in any, you have similar stories coming out of Spain from the Franco period. But perhaps most importantly in this country is that we need to recognize that even if slavery ended in 1865, and if Jim Crow officially ended sometime, in the 1980s, we're still dealing with a situation today where people within the African-American community are still suffering the same kind of transgenerational trauma that has come down to them over more than 100 years, 150 plus years from the experience of slavery. It's real. And if it's been proven to be real on 3 generations later through studies of Holocaust survivors, Jewish Holocaust survivors, then we have to acknowledge that this is true across the board. And it's necessary for us as a nation to face this because these people need to heal. And they can't end the racism that still exists out of this. Only the white population, by owning their own history in this country, can bring some end and some resolution to this. The same way that after World War II, the Allies, the American government, the British government, the French, forced the new Germany to face what the old Germany did. And young Germans since the 1950s have been educated in school from an early age about the crimes that their country committed and why. That we have to do the same thing here. We have to own it. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Holocaust survivors or we're talking about African Americans today who are still feeling the effects of slavery and Jim Crow. We're talking about Dominicans who suffered under Trujillo or Argentines who suffered under the Peronist regimes there. It's all basically the same thing. Is it to different degrees? Yes, but it's the same thing.
And while I agree with you 100%, I don't think Americans will ever do that. People don't even want to wear a mask, right? So having to come to terms with the racial history of this country is too heavy of a lift, I think, for far too many Americans, unfortunately. What I find interesting is how you compare Trujillo to Trump. And I think it's right on the money, right? I don't think people realize how narrowly we dodged the bullet.
Oh,
you know what I mean? And yeah, really close. And I don't want to go too off topic talking about Trump, but I think it's important because, Trujillo was what Trump could have become. Right.
Yeah.
And I think we were on the way there. If you could just speak briefly, I don't want to take too much from the book, but talk about that a bit.
So, Trujillo and Trump, it's interesting because when I was writing The Interpreter, I started writing The Interpreter in June of 2015, and I wrote it through the election the following year. And the research I was doing on a daily basis, every time I would do some research, Trump would say something that, was exactly an image, it was just a reflection of something that either, Hitler or some other Nazi had said or done that day. And it was very, very frightening. And so when Trump was elected, the question was, who is he? Is he Mussolini? Is he Hitler? Is he Stalin? And then one day I realized, no, he's Trujillo. He's a racist bigot who claims he's not. And he's a serial rapist.
Yeah.
And everything was transactional. He figured he could buy everybody off. And so he was Trujillo. And look how much damage he did, because what I see as someone who's looking in from outside is that the damage that Trujillo did is continuing today.
I agree.
Even within the Republic, the Dominican Republic, you see it in everything, in politics, in daily life. You see the effects of him. And it's been 40 plus. Yeah, 40
more. And you got a 61.
Yeah, 61. So it's like 50 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable how long this stuff has. It has a very long half-life.
It really does. One of the things that you were alluding to before that I find interesting is the idea that all immigrants are that every immigrant story is essentially the same, right? There's a line in the book that I love. And it talks about another part of the immigrant story, but it's the same thing. You said the pull of tradition and shared history paled in comparison to the siren song of America. And again, that's talking about the latter part of the immigrant story, but the idea that every immigrant story is the same. Can you expound on that a bit?
Sure, I'd love to. And I was talking about this with somebody earlier today. I think the thing with immigration is that it's born of necessity. The truth is, people aren't born in a place. They have a life, they have a culture, they have a family, they have a tradition. They feel a place of warmth. They don't wake up one day and say, you know, I don't want to be here anymore. I think I want to go to America. The reason people make immigration is because they have to. It's a necessity. They can't, there's no work. Look, you know, when I go down to DR, people tell me all the time, you know, can you help me come to the United States? There's no work. We have no life. There's nothing. We can't do anything for our children. So people want to come here. Because they believe the same way that the Jews did 100 years ago and 125 years ago, that they used to call this the Golden Medina, means the golden land. And the Chinese used to call it, the Chinese immigrants called it the Golden Mountain. That what they saw in the United States and America was opportunity. That they could go and they could work and they could make money, and that their children somehow would be better off, that they would be assimilated into American culture, and they would not, they would have better lives. So that's why people come here. So, you know, the problem for all immigrant stuff is that there's this place that they leave, and this is where they leave their heart. Okay, and this is what's in their memory. And for many, for the more fortunate or maybe unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, they, at some point, they're able to go back and they're able to the place that they left. But what they find is that it's not the same. That it's not the same place they left. That place they left now exists only in their minds, in their memory, and it's gone. It's fleeting. It's a snapshot of a moment in time. So the immigrant is caught between this desperate rock and a hard place where they, you know, this desire to have a better life, but at the same time longing for this place from whence they came. And that's the common experience of immigration. And it's a difficult experience under any consideration. And, you know, in sort of relating it to what we've seen and even still seeing now, and I talk a lot about this as a result of the work I did in The Interpreter, where, to make a very long story short, for those of you who are not familiar with the book or the time in the period prior to the start of World War II, German-Jewish families would send their children on what were called kinder transports, on trains out of Germany. And they eventually went to Paris, to Belgium, to London, some to the United States, to get their kids out of Germany. And so these mothers and fathers would stand on the platform, smiling and waving goodbye to their children, knowing full well that they would likely never see them again. And in 99% of the cases, they didn't. Most of the parents died in camps. So compare that today to a woman in Central America, in Guatemala or Honduras or El Salvador or Nicaragua, who is living in a place where there's effectively no government, and wherever the towns they're living in are ruled by gangs. They're under constant threat. They're starving. There's no work. They have, you know, over 10 years, they've saved $101 American bills. And they hand these bills to their child who's 14 or 15 years old, and they say, go and find the border and get across, and somehow you'll bring me later, knowing full well they'll never see their children again. So that, my point being, how does that differ? It doesn't. It's exactly the same thing. And that's the thing that prompts people to make this journey. It's a very difficult journey. You know, I have a friend who lives up on Fort Washington Avenue, who is an immigration attorney. And she's a high-class immigration attorney. She deals with very wealthy people who want to come to the United States and be able to stay here on more than a visitor's visa. That's really not the truth of immigration. The truth of immigration are people who wait for 10 years for their ability, their chance to come because they're on a list, or who sneak across a border. And unfortunately, the problem we're faced with, and this is a problem in American history, you know, there's always a superior group who does not want to see anyone change. They don't want to see any change in the demographics. That was the route to the 1924 immigration bill, which we're still living under today with modifications that came in 1965, I think. So, you know, you have to keep in mind that that is the experience of immigration, and it's hard, but it's a universal thing. And for me, I think it's an important message, and I try to bring it to readers as often as I can.
You know, on a lighter note, it's something that I see in your work in terms of Maximo Rothman or Redmond. I see it in you, and I also see it in a lot of, like, my friends growing up. You know, the Washington Heights that I grew up in, it's a different place than it was now, and I grew up in the 190s, And it was a lot of Dominican kids, but a lot of Black American kids. You know, that was probably the next biggest group in my little neck of the woods in my time growing up. And a lot of my Black American friends, they just became Dominican, right? Like they were around us so much that they would talk just like you. They would come to my house and eat the same foods, and that, you know, and that becoming Dominican is a constant theme. It's your life and in the books. And why is that important? Why do you even love Dominican Republic so much? You know, I've always said you're like an honorary Dominican. Why does DR have a special place in your heart and in your work?
So the DR has a lot of special meaning for me. I mean, first of all, before I knew Dominican people and before I lived in Washington Heights, even when I was a child, a kid, so I told you, my uncle, Bax Greenfield, my uncle lived in these along the border with Hungary and Slovakia. They were Hungarian speaking, but in 1919, the town where they lived became Slovakia. So to make a long story short, my uncle was on the run, and the immigration laws were terrible. My grandfather was here. My grandfather was on the last boat in on December 31st, 1923. Absolute truth. I have the records. So he was on the last boat to come in. So he wanted to bring his family. He wanted to bring his brothers and sisters, and you know they were under tremendous threat in Europe. And long story short, the government said no. They granted him one visa for his mother, because under the law, if his mother came, she could apply to bring all of her children. That's the way the law works still today. If you want to bring, you can bring a mother, a father, a son or a daughter, or a husband or a wife. You can't bring siblings. You got to bring your mother, and then your mother could bring your siblings. So she was granted one visa, but by the time this was all settled and the visa was sent, she was living in Slovakia, and this visa was sent to Prague, which was in the Czech part of the Republic, which had already been absorbed by Germany. As a Jew, she couldn't cross that border to get the visa. So she never got the visa, and she died in a place called Sobibor. And so my grandfather, he was trying to bring them, but he couldn't. So my uncle was very rich in Europe, and he was able to get as far as Italy. And then the war broke out between Italy and Germany and France, and he was in a concentration camp in Italy. And through the Avion Conference, as I mentioned, you know, Trujillo had agreed to take refugees. So an organization called DORSA, Dominican Republic Settlement Association, visited this concentration camp where he was, and he said, if you come to the DR, in 1 year you can bring your entire family. So between him and his wife, my aunt, there was like 30 plus people. So they said, we're going. So they had no idea where they were going. They didn't even know where the DR was, you know. So, but they got on the boat and they went. So, you know, once I understood this story, which is by the time I was about 14 years old, I had really a special place for the DR in my heart. And then we moved up here, and I started to meet Dominican people, and I became friendly with Dominican guys at the gym. And what I found was that Dominican guys were very much like the Hungarian Jews that I grew up around in the Bronx, my family, that they were just similar. And the first time I went down to visit the DR, again, another long story short, my buddy said to me, you know, I have to go down for a week for my daughter's first birthday. Why don't you come with me? You're not working. And I said, I can't just go running off to the DR. And he said, why? You don't have a job. And he was right. And I said to my wife, do you mind? She said, no, go ahead. And I found a place there. I found something there that reminded me very, very much of where I came from and who I came from. These people were very warm and very touchy. You know, it's an interesting thing. Americans are very, very particular about their personal space. You can't get too close. Don't touch me, you know, but you go down to DR and everyone's touching everyone and everyone's close in and everyone's talking at the same time. And this was exactly like the world that I grew up in. So I immediately fell in love with this. I fell in love with it. And it was completely natural to me. The music, the food, it just was natural. You know, it's such silly little things like, believe it or not, the style of Dominican cooking is very similar to Hungarian cooking, except that we use noodles, not rice. Lots of beans, lots of potted meat, lots of roasts. It's very similar. So the food was easy for me to adjust to. Music. Americans don't really listen to music and they don't dance much. DR, there's music everywhere all the time and people were always dancing. When I was a kid, we would get together at these family functions in these Hungarian organizations. There was unbelievable amounts of food and music and people danced all the time. So it was so natural for me and I fell in love with it. And it's really how it happened.
Nice. I also want to touch, there's a schism between Stephen's religious devotion and his father lack thereof, you know. Why is that important to the book? And if you could talk a little bit about that division within the Jewish community.
Okay, so first of all, you know, let's talk about specifically with them. So Max Rothman, he walks away, is a nice term. He rejects his connection to Jewish religion. And that really has to do with his experience of having escaped from Europe versus the experience of his brothers, sisters, and parents who die in Europe, in the camps, excuse me. And if you read Maximo Rothman, Forgiving Maximo Rothman, you'll understand that entirely because it's a very, very complicated scene where he learns of their deaths and how he reacts to it. And it's not uncommon among people like him, both refugees, escapees, and survivors themselves, to reject Jewish religious observance and faith after what occurred. Because there's this question, how could God have permitted, you know, the massacre, the murder of 6 million Jews? It's a very, very big question that, you know, remains unanswered. And I will tell you that I'm not going to go into the explanation that the Orthodox give, but they did manage to come up with an explanation that borders on the ridiculous. So the others, though, cling to and return to the practice of their faith. Stephen, as a boy, he feels like he's in a limbo. There's a long hallway, and this is very common in survivor families. It was the case in my grandparents' house. There's a long hallway where there's pictures of lots of dead people, and you can't really ask about them. And when you discuss them in whispers. And those are the ones who died in the camps. He needs to know who he is and where he came from, but his father doesn't want to talk about that. And so he doesn't learn, and he doesn't know anything about Jewish ritual or Jewish belief or Jewish observance or Jewish culture, really. His father doesn't want anything to do with it. His mother goes along with it. So he feels a void. And then he meets this young woman who ultimately he marries, and she comes from the Orthodox community, and he finds solace in this. But I can't tell you why, because that'll give away the whole story. So you have to read the book to find out why. So that's on a micro level, that's kind of what goes on there. And it's not uncommon that people who lived through this experience rejected their past and their connections to their culture. And sometimes those who came later, they wanted to know more about it and they re-embraced it. That also had to do with a lot in terms of the original book. It had to do with how I sort of had a period of conflict about my own beliefs and my own feelings about my own culture. And that's really reflected in all of these stories because that's where it originally came from. And I did find my way back, but it took time. On a bigger level, you know, I think that there's sort of a bigger problem. And that has to do with people not communicating and not crossing lines. So if you look at, for instance, Washington Heights, what we have in Washington Heights is a rather sizable community of religious Jews. But these are very religious Jews. And they're very insular. B, they keep to themselves. C, they look a certain way. They dress a certain way. And for people who are not Jewish and who don't have exposure to the Jewish community, when they think of Jewish, this is what they think of because it's visible. Now, what's interesting about that is that let's say there's a story about Israel on the news and the local news wants to do a man in the street interview. They'll go into the street and they'll always look for a guy or a woman who looks obviously Jewish by their dress. Now, 99.9% of the time, that person is going to be Orthodox and they're going to have certain politics and certain beliefs as a result of that. That's the world they come from. The truth of the matter is that 80% of American Jews, a little over, actually 82% of American Jews, look like me. They don't look like they're religious and they don't have these same kinds of beliefs. So there's this very large community. I mean, there's 5 million or 6 million Jews in the United States. And, 80% of those people live my kind of life. They don't live the Orthodox life. So, and it's interesting that Jewish readers take away a very different message from these books than non-Jewish readers, because there's a lot of sort of inside stuff there that if you're Jewish, you kind of notice this. But if you're not Jewish, you'll just read through the story and it doesn't make a difference.
Do you think you offend certain Jewish readers?
Oh, I definitely do.
Yeah.
I think I've told you, yes. I've gotten pigeonholed in the supermarket. There was one very funny moment when a woman in the produce department of the Key Food, she took me apart. How could I portray Orthodox people in such a way? And it's terrible. And I give the wrong impression to the non-Jews in the neighborhood. And then another Orthodox woman came charging with her cart across the produce section to give her an argument. I simply backed away and bought ice cream, Orthodox readers tend to have a real problem with what I've written, but I don't really care. You know what? Their truth is no less, or I should say the truth about my view of their world is no less truth than the way they want to view themselves. I have a neighbor, there's a line in Forgiving Stephen Redmond very early in the book where Kurchenko, who has real issues with his Jewishness. He says, he refers to an Orthodox person as a subject of superstition, someone who's subject to superstitious beliefs. And a neighbor of mine who's Orthodox was very, very offended by that. And I said to her, you have to understand that, you're reading the thoughts of this character.
Right, exactly.
Not my thoughts, this character's thoughts. Right. So you have to take it from where it comes. But what I would say to people who are not Jewish is that, you have to understand that we are a very diverse community. We are as diverse as a community, frankly, as the Latino world is diverse. People in this country, anyone who speaks Spanish, to many people is Mexican. Not really. There's 22 Spanish-speaking countries, and they share a language, but they don't necessarily share the same culture. The culture of Argentina, where I visited, is very different than the culture of Mexico or the Dominican Republic, both places I've been as well. So, I think that there's a need for understanding about diversity within, sort of groups. They're not monolithic. They're more, and they're not flat. They're very textured.
Yeah, and I find it interesting how all these different people live in this small area, and whatever that happens. I want to go to another topic. Sure. Since we're getting close to the end of our time together. There's a scene in the book where Pete and Tolya go to visit a old cop in a nursing home. He was the cop that had really had the case in the 60s. And who they meet is this nasty racist person. Unfortunately, we still, a nasty racist person killed George Floyd, right, last year, right? He's on trial right now. That nastiness and that racism is still so much of a part of police culture. And if you want to just give your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. I put it in there purposely because I wanted to really to express my own feelings about how little has changed in terms of policing. Policing needs a lot of reform. And the way I really want to frame this is I want to tell you a little story which happened to my wife and I last summer. It was within the month or so after the killing of George Floyd, when there was some very nonviolent demonstrations, nothing more than people getting together and expressing their frustration here in Washington Heights. And the precinct around the corner, was it the 33rd precinct, or the 34th precinct, had put up all kinds of barricades. And my wife, as we were walking by one evening, we'd gone out for dinner and we're walking home, there was a cop standing there, guarding the barricades. And, I should point out that the cop was Latino. He was clearly, by his look and by his name, Latino and probably Dominican. And my wife said to him, when is this nonsense going to stop? Why is this up? And his response to her was, when your nonsense stops. And so what does that mean? What it means is that the cops, once they become blue, they're no longer white, black, or brown. And it's a problem. They view themselves from a position of victimization. and they don't have trust in people who are not police. So with that said, I really wanted to sort of demonstrate how very little has changed in terms of this over the past, 50, 60 years. And it disturbs me tremendously, because the last thing we needed here, where there was nothing but peaceful expression of our anger, was for the cops to feel so threatened, and they love to be victims, to put up barricades around the police station. I don't believe in any way that there's any part of this community that would have attacked that police station. It just would never have happened. But this is how they think. And, it's a subject that needs to be discussed. And, given the fact that I have, a small bully pulpit, I'm going to continue to discuss it. I'm interested, are there any questions that anyone has from the audience about?
I didn't see any in there.
Okay, so with that said, we've got about 5 minutes.
Yeah, and I have another question. When
All right, you ask me, and then I'll finish up.
so there's a little story at the end of the book. What's that about? What are you teasing there?
Okay, so as I said, it's a 3-part series, and I wanted to bridge for the reader to get on to the next book, which is Forgiving Mariela Camacho. So the story at the end of this book, which is, we call it a bonus story, is actually the backstory for how the mystery of Forgiving Mariela Camacho began. And it then is referred to about a third of the way into the story, into the book itself.
Gotcha.
So, I'm hoping that you all will read all books, but if you start with Forgiving Stephen Redmond, that you will then read the story, and you'll be interested enough to read Forgiving Mariela Camacho. So with that said, you can purchase my books through Word Up. And if you prefer, and I know I'm not supposed to do this, but we discussed it. If you prefer e-copies or e-readers, you can do that online at any of a number of places that sell, ebooks, including Amazon. And if you do read my books, keep in mind that I am an independent author. I do have a publisher, but you do have Emmanuel. You can sell ebooks.
Yeah.
Okay. If you can, buy your ebooks through Word Up.
They're available in the book pages. You'll see options for ebooks and audiobooks.
Terrific. Thank you.
What was the F for? You put F Amazon. I wasn't sure what the F stood for.
Oh, you know what.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So please go to Amazon when you're done and write a review, because those reviews help me to sell books. And please, if you like my books, recommend my books to your friends and your neighbors and your family, but don't ever lend them.
No lending. You heard that?
No lending.
No lending.
Make sure they buy their own books.
Tell them to stop being cheap and buy the book. Support local art.
And don't buy any used copies anywhere either.
That's right.
And I want to thank you for inviting me. And as always, it's a pleasure to converse with you about my work. I hope to have my next book out. Oh, actually, before I forget. So I've submitted a manuscript to my publisher, and it's a little different. It's a little off the track for me. It's a novella, and it's with 6 short stories, and it's called Becoming Bachata, and the novella is called the King of Arroyo Hondo, and the whole thing is set in the Dominican Republic in the present, and it's really based on my experiences in the DR and the people that I've met there, and how much I love the place. And that should be out in about a year or so. And it's so I said it'll be called at this point it's tentatively titled Becoming Bachata, with the novella The King of Arroyo Hondo. And there's no dead bodies, well, maybe just one, and there's no Jews, just Dominicans. So I continue on the same path, and then I'm working on a book about refugees from Castro. So I hope that you will all enjoy some of my work, and let me know that how you felt about it. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you guys so much. And just wanted to quickly shout out all the sponsors, which one of them is obviously Uptown Collective, the YM and YWHA of Washington Heights and Inwood, and NOMA.
NOMA.
Thank you, NOMA. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you guys for coming. And just make sure, you shop at your local bookshop or ours. And definitely do leave reviews on Amazon. I'm not gonna lie, even I check reviews on Amazon. I just don't shop there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you
y'all.
all very much.
Have a great night, everyone.
Spread love is the Uptown way. That's my motto. All right,
That's
y'all.
for sure.